There is something most people misunderstand about people like you, and if you are honest, you probably believed it at some point too. They look at you and see someone who feels too much, thinks too deeply, notices things that others ignore, and they call it weakness. They call it overthinking. They call it being too sensitive. And after hearing that enough times, you start to question yourself. You wonder why certain tones bother you, why certain energy shifts feel so loud, why you can sense something is off, even when everything looks fine on the surface. But here is what most people never realize. You are not overreacting. You are not imagining things. You are picking up signals that others simply do not see. The real problem is not your sensitivity. It is that no one ever taught you how to understand it. And once you do, the very thing that made you feel weak will become one of the sharpest advantages you have. What most people call sensitivity is not weakness. It is untrained perception. And the difference between those two is everything. When you walk into a room and immediately feel the tension before anyone says a word, when you notice a shift in someone's tone that others completely miss, when you sense that something about a situation is off even though everything looks normal on the surface, that is not fragility, that is data. The problem is not that you are receiving too much. The problem is that no one ever showed you how to process what you are receiving. So instead of feeling like clarity, it feels like overload. It feels like confusion. It feels like emotional noise that you cannot organize. And over time, you start to believe that the issue is you, when in reality, the issue is the lack of structure around what you are perceiving. In behavioral analysis, there is a concept that most people are unaware of, and that is the difference between signal and interpretation. The signal is objective. It is the micro-expression, the hesitation before a response, the mismatch between words and body language, the slight delay that does not align with a genuine reaction. The interpretation is what your mind does with it. And this is where untrained sensitivity becomes a problem, because you are picking up accurate signals, but without a framework. Your brain starts guessing, overanalyzing, second-guessing, creating stories to fill in the gaps. That is why sensitivity often feels like anxiety in the early stages, not because it is inaccurate, but because it is unmanaged. I have seen this pattern over and over again. People who can read a room faster than anyone else, people who notice inconsistencies almost instantly, but the moment they become aware of it, they question themselves. They dismiss it. They assume they are overthinking. And what happens over time is they learn to distrust their own perception, which is one of the most damaging things that can happen to someone with this level of awareness, because once you stop trusting what you see, you become vulnerable in a completely different way. Not because you cannot read people, but because you override what you read in order to stay comfortable or to avoid conflict. Think about how many times you felt something was off about a person, but you ignored it. How many times you sensed a shift in energy but convinced yourself it was nothing. How many times you picked up on a contradiction but gave the benefit of the doubt anyway. That is not a lack of ability. That is a lack of confidence in your own perception. And that lack of confidence does not come from nowhere. It is usually conditioned. When you grow up being told that you are too sensitive, too emotional, too reactive, you do not learn how to refine your perception. You learn how to suppress it. You learn to override your instincts in favor of what is socially acceptable. You learn to ignore internal signals in order to maintain external harmony. But suppression does not remove the signal. It just disconnects you from it. And when that happens, the signal starts showing up as discomfort, as stress, as a constant sense that something is not right, but you cannot explain why. Now, here is where things start to shift. Because the moment you begin to understand that what you are feeling is not random, that it is actually information, everything changes. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" you start asking, "What am I noticing?" Instead of assuming you are overreacting, you start observing what triggered the reaction. Instead of trying to get rid of the feeling, you start decoding it. This is the transition from untrained sensitivity to awareness, and awareness is where your advantage begins. Because once you stop fighting your perception and start organizing it, what used to feel like chaos becomes clarity. You begin to separate what you feel from what is actually happening. You begin to identify patterns instead of isolated moments. You begin to recognize that the same types of behaviors produce the same internal responses, and once you see patterns, you are no longer guessing, you are recognizing. That is a completely different level of interaction with the world. At that point, you are not just reacting to emotions. You are reading behavior. And behavior does not lie as easily as words do. This is why people who develop this ability become very difficult to deceive, not because they are suspicious of everything, but because they are attuned to inconsistencies that most people overlook. And the key here is understanding that this was always there. This was never something you had to build from scratch. It was something you had to learn how to use. Your sensitivity was never the problem. Your lack of training was. And once you begin to train it, once you begin to trust it, once you begin to refine it instead of suppressing it, you stop experiencing it as a burden and start experiencing it as precision. And precision, in a world full of noise, is a very rare form of power. Most people think sensitivity is a personality trait you are simply born with. Something soft, something optional, something you either have or you do not. But that is not how it actually develops. For many people like you, in reality, what you call sensitivity is often the result of adaptation, not preference. It is something that was built under pressure, shaped in environments where paying attention was not a choice. It was a necessity. When you grow up in a space where emotions are unpredictable, where tone can shift without warning, where tension can rise without explanation, you learn very quickly that noticing small changes matters. You learn to read faces before words. You learn to listen to how something is said more than what is said. You learn to detect what is underneath because what is on the surface is not always reliable. This is not something a child consciously decides to do. It happens automatically because the brain is designed to keep you safe, and in an unstable environment, safety comes from anticipation. So you start scanning, not because you are curious, but because you need to know. You need to know when someone is about to become angry, when a situation is about to turn, when something is about to go wrong. Over time, this constant scanning becomes a pattern, and that pattern becomes part of how you experience the world. What other people see as normal interaction, you experience as layers of information, subtle shifts, contradiction, unspoken signals that most people never register. And because this ability develops early, long before you have language for it, it does not feel like a skill. It feels like who you are. But here is the part that most people miss. When a child develops this level of awareness, it is rarely in a calm or supportive environment. It is usually in a space where something is off, something is inconsistent, something requires constant adjustment. And that has consequences because while this kind of awareness gives you an advantage in reading people, it also comes with a cost when you are always scanning, always anticipating, always adjusting. Your system does not fully relax. It stays alert, even when there is no immediate threat. This is why many people who are highly sensitive also feel easily overwhelmed, not because they are weak, but because their system has been trained to process more input than average. And without understanding where that comes from, it is easy to misinterpret it as a flaw. You might think there is something wrong with you because you cannot just switch off, because you cannot ignore what others ignore, because you feel things more intensely than the people around you. But what you are actually experiencing is the after effect of a system that was trained to notice everything, and here is where the shift begins. Because when you understand that this did not come from nowhere, that it was built through repetition, through exposure, through the need to adapt, you stop seeing it as random and start seeing it as patterned. You begin to realize that your awareness has roots, that your ability to read situations did not appear by accident. It was developed through experience, often difficult experience, and that realization changes how you relate to it. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" you start asking, "What did this teach me?" Instead of trying to get rid of it, you start understanding its function, because at its core, this level of sensitivity is not about emotion. It is about prediction. It is about recognizing patterns before they fully emerge. It is about detecting shifts before they become obvious. That is why people like you often notice things earlier than others. You see changes before they escalate. You sense dynamics before they become visible. And while that may have felt overwhelming when you were younger, when you did not have control over it, it becomes something entirely different when you begin to work with it instead of against it. The same awareness that once made you anxious can become clarity. The same sensitivity that once made you feel out of place can become precision. But only if you understand where it came from and why it exists. Because once you see that this was not a weakness you were born with, but a response you developed, you stop trying to fix yourself and start learning how to use what you already have. And that is a very different position to operate from, because you are no longer someone who is overwhelmed by your own perception. You become someone who can direct it, refine it, and eventually trust it. What most people call pain, you experienced as repetition, and repetition is what trains perception, whether you realize it or not. It was not one moment that shaped you, it was patterns. Patterns of being misunderstood, patterns of trusting too quickly and paying for it, patterns of noticing something was off and then watching it prove itself later. And when something repeats enough times, your mind starts looking for structure. It starts asking questions, not on the surface but underneath. Not what happened, but why it happened. Not what they said, but what they meant. Not what you felt, but what triggered it. This is where something begins to change. Because pain, when it is conscious, does not just wound you, it forces you to observe. An observation, repeated over time, becomes recognition. You begin to notice that certain types of people behave in predictable ways, that certain tones carry hidden intentions, that certain forms of kindness come with conditions attached. At first, it feels like overthinking, like you are analyzing too much. But what you are actually doing is pattern mapping. You are connecting dots across time, across interactions, across different people who display the same underlying behavior, And once those patterns become clear, something shifts inside you. You stop being surprised. You may still feel disappointment, but you are no longer confused. And that is a critical difference, because confusion keeps you stuck, but clarity allows you to move differently. Think about how many times you ignored your first instinct because you wanted to believe the best. How many times you rationalized behavior that did not sit right. How many times you gave people explanations they did not earn. Each of those moments did something to you. Not just emotionally, but cognitively. They forced your brain to reconcile contradiction, to hold two realities at once. What you wanted to be true, and what you were actually seeing. And over time, that tension creates depth, because you cannot stay on the surface anymore. You are pushed to look deeper, to understand human behavior beyond appearances. This is why many people who go through repeated emotional pain develop a kind of intelligence that cannot be taught in a classroom. It is the ability to distinguish between what is presented and what is real, between charm and character, between attention and genuine care. And these distinctions are not abstract. They are practical. They determine who you trust, who you invest in, who you allow into your space. Now, here is where the transformation becomes important, because pain can lead in two directions. It can make you bitter, closed, reactive, or it can refine you. It can sharpen your perception without hardening your core. And for people like you, the difference often comes down to whether you stay aware of what you are learning or you shut it down to avoid feeling it. If you shut it down, you lose the lesson and keep the wound. But if you stay present, if you allow yourself to actually observe what is happening, you begin extracting information from the experience. You start seeing that the issue was not that you felt too much. It was that you trusted without enough information, that you gave without enough filtering, that you interpreted signals but did not act on them. And once you see that clearly, something powerful happens. You stop blaming your sensitivity and start refining your judgment. You begin to trust the initial signals you pick up instead of overriding them. You begin to notice when behavior does not match words and take that seriously. You begin to understand that consistency over time is a more reliable indicator than intensity. In a moment, this is where pain becomes training, not because it was pleasant, but because it was precise. It showed you exactly where your perception was correct and where your decisions did not align with it. And that alignment is everything, because perception without action keeps you stuck. But perception with aligned action changes your outcomes. Over time, this creates a very different kind of presence. You are no longer easily pulled into situations that drain you. You are no longer surprised by behavior that used to confuse you. You are no longer dependent on what people say because you have learned to read what they do. And that is not something you were given. That is something you earned through paying attention when it would have been easier to look away. So, when you look back at what you went through, it is important to understand that it was not just damage. It was data. It was information about people, about patterns, about yourself. And once you start treating it that way, you stop seeing your past as something that weakened you and start seeing it as something that trained you to see what others still miss. There is a point where your strength quietly turns against you. And most people do not see it happening in real time, because the same sensitivity that allows you to understand others, to read emotional undercurrents, to recognize pain that is not being spoken, can also lead you into a pattern where you start carrying what was never yours to carry. And this is where empathy, when it is not grounded in discernment, begins to shift into self-erosion. It does not feel like destruction at first. It feels like kindness. It feels like being patient, being understanding, being the person who stays when others leave. You tell yourself you are helping, that you are giving people space, that you are seeing the good in them, even when it is not obvious. But over time, something subtle begins to change. Because the more you explain away behavior that does not sit right, the more you train yourself to ignore your own signals, you begin to override your perception in favor of preserving the connection. And that is where the imbalance starts. You start giving more than what is being reciprocated. You start investing energy into people who are not invested in themselves. You start staying in situations that require you to constantly adjust to keep things stable. And the reason this is so dangerous is because it does not look like harm on the surface. It looks like compassion, but underneath, it is costing you clarity. It is costing you self-respect. It is costing you alignment with your own instincts. Think about how often you've explained someone's behavior to yourself in a way that made it easier to tolerate. How often you have minimized something that bothered you because you understood where it came from. How often you have stayed longer than you should have because you believed that if you just gave a little more, things would balance out. That pattern is not random. It comes from a belief that if you can feel someone's pain, you are responsible for it. And that belief is what turns empathy into self-destruction, because feeling something does not mean you are meant to fix it. Understanding someone does not mean you are meant to absorb the consequences of their behavior, and staying does not always mean you are helping. In many cases, staying simply teaches the other person that they do not need to change because there is no real consequence for their actions. This is where the dynamic becomes distorted because your empathy begins to remove accountability from the situation. You become the one who adapts, the one who explains, the one who absorbs, while the other person remains unchanged. And over time, this creates a quiet form of resentment, not necessarily toward them, but toward yourself. Because on some level, you are not honoring what you see. You are not acting on what you feel. You are not respecting your own perception. And that internal conflict builds slowly until it reaches a point where you can no longer ignore it. This is the moment most people describe as exhaustion, but it is more than that. It is clarity breaking through. It is the realization that what you thought was compassion was actually overextension, that what you thought was loyalty was actually self-abandonment, that what you thought was patience was actually avoidance of a decision you did not want to make. And once you see that clearly, it becomes very difficult to go back to the old pattern, because now you understand something fundamental. Empathy without boundaries is not sustainable. It will always cost you more than it gives. And more importantly, it will distort your perception of what healthy connection looks like. You begin to recognize that true connection does not require you to ignore your instincts. It does not require you to continuously explain basic respect. It does not require you to sacrifice your sense of self just to maintain it. That realization is uncomfortable because it forces you to confront how much of your energy has been placed in the wrong places. How many times you gave without structure. How often you equated being needed with being valued. But it is also necessary because without that awareness, the pattern continues. You keep attracting the same dynamics, the same imbalances, the same outcomes, just with different people. And the only way that changes is when you stop confusing empathy with responsibility, because the moment you separate those two, everything shifts. You can still understand people without carrying them. You can still care without overgiving. You can still be compassionate without abandoning yourself. And that is the line that turns empathy back into strength, instead of something that slowly drains you without you realizing it. There comes a moment when something inside you stops negotiating, and it does not happen loudly. It does not come with a dramatic declaration. It comes quietly, almost like a realization you cannot unsee. After enough repetition, enough giving without balance, enough situations where your perception was right, but your actions did not follow it, you reach a point where the cost becomes undeniable, and that is where the shift begins. Not because you suddenly become stronger, but because you become clearer. You start seeing the pattern instead of the person. You start recognizing that it was never just about one situation. It was about a consistent dynamic that kept repeating in different forms. And once you see that pattern, you cannot interact with it the same way anymore. This is where boundaries begin. Not as a technique, but as a response to clarity. Before this point, you might have believed that saying no was harsh, that distance was rejection, that protecting your energy was selfish. But now you begin to understand something different, that every time you ignored your own signal, you paid for it. And every time you overextended yourself, you lost something you had to rebuild later. So the question changes. It is no longer, how do I keep this connection? It becomes, what is this connection costing me? And that question alone shifts your entire behavior. You start noticing where your energy goes, who requires constant explanation, who only shows up when they need something, who respects your time, and who assumes access to it. And instead of immediately responding the way you used to, you pause. That pause is where your power starts to take shape, because in that space, you are no longer reacting automatically. You are choosing, and choice changes everything. You begin to respond differently, not by becoming cold, but by becoming selective. You stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided not to understand. You stop offering solutions to people who are invested in their own dysfunction. You stop giving access to people who have not shown consistency, and this is where the shift becomes visible to others. People who were used to a certain version of you start noticing the change. They may say you are different, less available, less accommodating, less tolerant. And in a way, they are right. But what they are actually reacting to is the removal of predictability, because before, your behavior was easy to anticipate. You would explain, you would stay, you would forgive without real change. You would adjust to keep things stable. That predictability made it easy for others to operate without accountability. But boundaries interrupt that pattern. When you stop responding the way people expect, the dynamic changes immediately. Some people will respect it, some will adjust, and some will resist it. And that resistance tells you more than anything else ever could. Because people who benefited from your lack of boundaries will almost always push against your boundaries when you create them. And that is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is evidence that the dynamic has shifted. This is why boundaries are so powerful, not because they control others, but because they reveal them. They show you who can meet you at a different level and who cannot. And once you see that clearly, your decisions become simpler. You are no longer trying to maintain every connection. You are maintaining alignment. You start to understand that access and intimacy are not the same thing. That just because someone is in your life does not mean they deserve your energy, your time, or your emotional availability. This distinction is critical, because without it, You give too much to the wrong people and not enough to the right ones. But with it, your energy becomes intentional. You place it where there is reciprocity, where there is consistency, where there is respect, and over time, this creates a completely different experience of connection. You feel less drained, less conflicted, less divided within yourself, because for the first time, your actions are aligned with your perception. You are no longer seeing one thing and doing another. That alignment is where real stability comes from. It is not about controlling the outside world. It is about no longer betraying what you know to be true. And that is why this moment is a turning point. Because once you experience what it feels like to honor your own boundaries, even in small ways, it becomes very difficult to go back to ignoring them. You realize that protecting your energy does not make you less caring. It makes your care sustainable. It does not make you distant. It makes your presence intentional. And most importantly, it does not make you lose connection. It makes your connections real. At a certain point, something shifts in a way that is difficult to explain if you have not experienced it yourself. Because what once felt like emotional overwhelm starts organizing into something much more precise. You are no longer just feeling everything. You are understanding what you are feeling and why it is happening. This is where sensitivity evolves into discernment, and the difference between those two states is what separates confusion from clarity. In the earlier stages, you might have picked up on tension without knowing its source. You sensed dishonesty, but doubted your own instinct. You noticed inconsistencies, but explained them away in the name of being fair or compassionate. But over time, after enough patterns, enough repeated experiences where your initial perception proved accurate, you begin to trust what you see, and trust in your perception changes how you move through the world. You stop reacting to every signal emotionally and start observing it strategically instead of immediately engaging. You watch, you listen, you register details that most people overlook. You begin noticing how someone responds under pressure, how their tone shifts when they are not in control, how their behavior aligns or conflicts with their words over time. These are not random observations. They are data points. And once you have enough of them, patterns become undeniable. This is where discernment becomes powerful, because you are no longer relying on isolated moments. You are recognizing consistent behavior across time. You see when charm is rehearsed rather than natural. You see when praise is used as leverage rather than appreciation. You see when vulnerability is being performed rather than genuinely expressed. And the key difference now is that you do not feel the need to confront every inconsistency you notice. Earlier, you might have tried to explain, to point things out, to make others see what you were seeing, but now you understand that not everyone is willing or able to recognize those patterns, and more importantly, you no longer need them to. That is a major shift, because it removes the need for validation. You do not need agreement to trust your perception. You simply adjust your behavior based on what you observe. And that is where your power becomes very quiet but very effective. You speak less, but when you do, it carries more weight. You react less, but you understand more. You do not get pulled into every emotional dynamic, because you can see where it leads before it fully unfolds. This is also where people often misunderstand you again, but in a different way. Before, they saw you as too sensitive. Now they may see you as distant or detached. But what has actually changed is not your ability to feel. It is your willingness to engage without clarity. You are no longer available to every emotional demand. You are selective. And selectivity can look like distance to those who were used to unlimited access. This is why discernment is often mistaken for coldness, but they are not the same. Coldness shuts down feeling. Discernment directs it. One disconnects, the other refines. And once you experience that refinement, you realize something important. You were never meant to absorb everything. You were meant to interpret it. That understanding removes a lot of unnecessary weight because you stop carrying emotions that are not yours. You stop taking behavior personally when it reflects patterns you have already seen. You stop being surprised by outcomes that follow predictable dynamics. This does not mean you become cynical. It means you become accurate. And accuracy creates stability because you are no longer reacting to appearances. You are responding to patterns. Over time, this builds a kind of presence that is hard to define but easy to feel. You become someone who is not easily manipulated, not easily rushed, not easily influenced by surface-level behavior, and people sense that, even if they cannot explain it, they may trust you without knowing why. They may feel understood without you saying much, because you are operating from a level of perception that goes beyond what is visible, and that is where sensitivity, once refined, becomes a form of intelligence that shapes how you navigate relationships, decisions, and environments. It is no longer something that overwhelms you. It becomes something that guides you, and when you reach that point, you realize that what once felt like a burden was actually training you to see clearly in a world where most people are still reacting to what is only on the surface. There is a final shift that changes everything. And it does not come from becoming harder, colder, or more distant. It comes from something much deeper than that. It comes from the moment you stop leaving yourself behind in order to keep things working. For a long time, most of your life probably revolved around adaptation. Adjusting your tone, softening your truth, holding back what you really saw or felt so that others would stay comfortable, so that conflict would not escalate, so that connection would not be lost. And while that may have helped you survive certain environments, it came with a cost that you could not fully see at the time. Because every time you adjusted in a way that went against what you knew internally, you created a split, a gap between what you perceived and how you acted. And maintaining that gap is exhausting. Not physically, but psychologically, because you are constantly managing two realities at once. What you know to be true and what you allow yourself to express. Over time, that creates a quiet form of tension, a sense that something is off, even when everything appears stable. And eventually, you reach a point where that tension becomes more uncomfortable than the possibility of being misunderstood. That is where the real shift begins. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is a decision, often made in a moment that seems small from the outside, but changes everything on the inside. You decide that you are no longer willing to abandon your own perception in order to maintain a connection. You decide that if something feels wrong, you will not explain it away just to keep the peace. You decide that your internal clarity matters more than external approval, and that decision reorganizes how you move through the world, because now, your actions start aligning with what you actually see and feel. You are no longer negotiating with your own instincts. You are operating from them. And when that alignment happens, something powerful emerges, not in the form of control over others, but in the form of stability within yourself. You become less reactive, not because you feel less, but because you are no longer conflicted internally. There is no longer a need to constantly evaluate whether you are allowed to trust what you perceive. You already made that decision. And that clarity creates a kind of presence that is very different from anything before it. You speak more directly, but with less effort. You set boundaries without needing to justify them endlessly. You walk away when necessary, not out of anger, but out of alignment, and perhaps most importantly, you stop defining yourself through what you went through. This is a critical part of the transformation because as long as your identity is tied to being the one who was misunderstood, the one who was hurt, the one who was used, you remain connected to those experiences in a way that limits your growth. But when you shift your focus from what happened to you to how you choose to live now, you reclaim something that was never meant to be taken from you. Your authorship. You begin organizing your life around your values instead of your wounds. And that changes the direction of everything because now, your sensitivity is no longer something you manage or hide. It is something you embody. It becomes part of how you think, how you decide, how you connect, without needing to be explained or justified. And this is where the concept of wholeness comes in. Before this point, different parts of you were in conflict. Your perception, your expression, your behavior, but now they begin to move together. What you see, what you feel, and what you do start to align, and alignment creates a level of strength that does not need to be proven. People can feel it without you saying anything. There is a steadiness, a groundedness, a sense that you are not easily moved by pressure, not because you are rigid, but because you are rooted. And rooted people are very difficult to control because they are not constantly adjusting to external expectations. They are anchored internally. This does not mean you stop caring. It means your care is no longer dependent on sacrificing yourself. It becomes intentional, directed, sustainable. You give where there is reciprocity. You stay where there is respect. You invest where there is growth. And where those things are absent, you step back without needing to create conflict or explanation. That is a different kind of power because it does not rely on force. It relies on clarity. And clarity removes a lot of the struggle that used to exist. You no longer need to convince people of your value. You no longer need to prove your perception. You no longer need to stay in places that require you to shrink because you understand something that you did not before, that your strength was never in how much you could tolerate. It was in how fully you could remain yourself without compromise. And once you reach that point, the question is no longer whether you are too sensitive. It becomes how you choose to use what you have. Because what once felt like a burden is now integrated, refined, and directed, and when you are no longer divided against yourself, you move through the world in a way that is not only stronger, but also far more peaceful, because for the first time, you are not leaving parts of yourself behind just to belong somewhere. You no longer need to stay.